Hello there, I'm Leo, and welcome to the second episode of Rediscovering Ashina, my in-depth analysis series on Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, covering anything from the game design, to the lore, to the setting and the cultural background of it, to the translation from the Japanese. A big passion project of mine, which I am doing together with learning how to do video making in general, so if everything goes according to plan, I will be getting better and better as this series goes on. If you've seen the first episode, then welcome back. I promise that at least the audio quality is going to take a big leap in quality in this one. I'm doing a little bit of a different setup, so I should be able to remove the background noises from the PlayStation and everything without damaging the game audio this time. And also I think I've learned from my mistakes, and I will not try to talk about so many things during the playthrough section of it, because that only gets me confused and I get lesser quality of just gameplay and everything. So instead, while I play, we'll just be talking about the gameplay and the lore and the narrative as it comes naturally across, and afterwards I will do my in-depth analysis about anything, about all the contextual stuff and the cultural stuff and the translation and all of that, and I will not mix the two, so that should reduce the length and make it just better to follow, I think. We'll discover it together, I guess. So, this video is going to be also much shorter, I assume, than the first one, because it will be needed to cover much less. So yeah, let's get into it, shall we? So, last we left off, our protagonist Wolf had his arm cut off by Genichiro Ashina after he tried to rescue his master Kuro, the Divine Hair, and woke up here with a new arm and an interesting person doing work alongside him. This is an interesting environment in general. There are a lot of statues all around, and they're all the same. And we can presume that he's responsible for that, also because where is it? There it goes. The Shinoi prosthetic mentions the sculptor, so yeah. No surprises here, this guy is the sculptor. Let's hear what he has to say. We're going to get a lot of dialogues done this section, not all that we can now, because I'm going to split them a little bit and organize them a little bit, but there is going to be a lot of talking in this episode. So, hope you're prepared for that.
お前さん、名は何という？その目、さしずめ、任に敗れた狼といったところか。言えぬ。それが忍びじゃな。わしは仏を掘らなきゃなら。お前さんはお前さんで好きにしな。何故俺はここにいる？ただ拾ったのよ。屍かどうかもわからぬものを野良犬に食わせてやることもあるまい。どれほど俺は眠っていた？お前さんを拾ってからずいぶん経つぞ。そうか。じゃが主の主はまだ生きておるぞ。アシナの城で囚われとなっている。だがすぐにもその血を利用されちまうだろう。お前さんを見ればその価値は十分にあろうというものじゃ。
So we get, we don't know much about this guy, but he has rescued us, and we seem to have miraculously survived. And some time has passed. We will see That is a very convenient way of phrasing it, but we know that enough time has passed for the event of the game to take place, basically. And there is mention, which I think is like the second one in the English version, of the bloodline. I think the first one was when Kuro was going through the secret passage and mentioned his own bloodline and he wanted to run away with it. But yes, the bloodline is apparently important, and we can ask about it. But first, let's talk about this new arm of ours.
この左腕、俺に何をした？
そいつは忍び義手。石腕の狼にはおあつらえ向きの牙じゃろうて。仏を掘るには無用でな。お前さんにくれてやる。
忍び義手。
そいつはただ失った腕を補うもんじゃない。人具を見つけたらわしのところに持ってくるがいい。
人具だと？そうか、このからくり。
察しがいいな。人具を持ってきたら忍び義手に仕込んでやる。そうすりゃその義手のありがたみがわかるじゃろうさ。喋りすぎたな。いい気な。
Absolutely not, as we still need to ask for the last thing.
巫女様の血が利用されるとはどういうことだ？
わしも詳しいことなど知らん。ただ流院、そう呼ばれる特別な血があるという。主の主はそれを持っておる。
それゆえ巫女様は
付け狙われる。お前さんの体が妙なことになっておるのもそのせいかもしれぬな。
Okay, so we have confirmed that this nice thingy was his originally, which checks with, his left arm missing and the fact that he said that the arm does not help in carving the Buddha. And we know that whatever is happening to our body, which is still undisclosed at this moment, is probably due to the Divine Hear's blood, and whoever captured him, assuming Kenichiro since he carried away, wants to use that power for himself.
お前さんもそうじゃが、この荒れ寺にはおかしな客がまあまあ訪れる。寺を出て右手の広場にもそうした者が一人おる。妙なことになっておる者同士、気が合うかもしれんな。
So he promised us friendship right off the bat. So, we are inside what looks like a temple originally. It's incredibly run down. It's filled to the brim with these very creepy wooden statues that don't seem to be tended all that much. It seems to just be doing them for the heck of it, really. And this little altar, this blood-stained altar, where this is my assumption, but I think this is where the arm was kept. I don't think he was wearing it beforehand. But yeah, there is this small thing on the side, which is quite out of place. It looks like an actual nice figurine, and as much we discover.
その優しい顔の仏様はわしの彫ったもんじゃねえ。誠の仏師が彫られたものだ。人が己の内にあるものと向き合う、そういった時に助けとなるだろう。
己の内にあるものとは？
怒り、悲しみ、あるいは古い過去の記憶、そういった類のものじゃ。
So this is an interesting thing. We cannot use it right now. It is said to be having been done by the true sculptor. And it's going to be, mechanically, it's going to be an interesting object, honestly. I am very confused by it, but we'll see later. It's not going to be relevant for a while yet. But he has a couple of other interesting things that he can tell us.
お前さんか。わしは仏を掘らなきゃなら。お前さんはお前さんで好きにしな。ああ、そこにある優しい顔の仏様。そいつには妙な真似をするなよ。
So yeah, a little bit of warning. He said that he needs to carve the Buddha, and we can do whatever we want.
お前さんか。わしは仏をお前さん。
A last thing, I think, that he can say.
ではな、また久しくらいならかしてやろう。
Yeah, that's it. As gruff as this character is, as this sculptor that proclaims to know nothing about nothing or to have talked too much already, he's surprisingly helpful and kind and hospitable in his own way, even if he doesn't really have much to offer. Like, as ugly and intimidating as he must be, especially when standing up, like, he must tower over us, considering how big he is just hunched down like that. He does not look like someone aggressive as much as simply gruff. But yeah, if we come outside, we immediately find someone else nearby. Before talking to this person, I want to take a little bit of a look around. First we see the temple, as run down as it is and covered in these talismans, in which I will have more to say about them later on. We see how crumbled it is. Like, there are these huge piles of cut stone all around, and if we circle on the back, first we've got a little reward, a light coin purse. A purse filled with a small amount of sen can be used to acquire the sen inside. Has a somewhat satisfying weight to it. The sen in this purse is not lost upon death. So, we come across in the classical Dark Souls thing of currency is apparently lost when you die, but not if you have these specific items to store it in, and it's money this time, not souls, not anything that otherworldly, just sen. And here there is a little bit of a hole, and we can take a peek inside. This is a very drafty building after all. But yeah, that established. Let's see what this person has to say.
誠に息を吹き返したのですね。流因の力、この目でしかと見ることになるとは。
何者だ？
エマと言います。去るお方に仕えるクスシです。
去るお方とは？
すみませぬが、主の命にて明かせません。ただ、あなたを助けよと、そう仰せつかっています。
うん。
信用しろとは言いません。ですが、私は主の命を果たさねばならぬのです。あなたが持っている薬水のひょうたん、それはもともと私が作り上げたものです。クスシとして助けとなりましょう。
このひょうたん、お主が作ったというのか？
はい。元は九郎様のためにあなたが譲り受けていたのですね。気づいているかもしれませんが、このひょうたんの薬水はおのずと湧き出します。尽きたとて少し休めばまた満ちるでしょう。
クスシとしての助けとは？
ひょうたんの種をお持ちください。
種だと？
はい。薬水は ひょうたんの種より湧き出します。新たな種を加えれば薬水の傘が増すでしょう。手に入れたら持ってきてください。
わかった。
So, before I talk more, this is Emma the physician. We know that she's the one that rescued us, she's the one that dropped the letter into the well and awoke us from our slumber. And she made the gourd that we used to heal the miraculous objects, so she's a good doctor. Most of the dialogue about it is basically just gameplay stuff. It just tells us how to heal and how to power it up, and the fact that it regenerates when we rest. But there is also a small detail that I find quite puzzling, to be honest, for reasons that will become clear much later, which is she said that she gave the object to Kuro. But yeah, I'll come back to that in a future episode when we will know more about the relationship between her and Kuro, but at least it confirms that they met and that they seems to be in good relationship. At least she seems to be to want to help him.
一つ頼みがあります。
なんだ。
少し顔を見せてください。
何？
白いあざ。これは生まれつきですか？
いや。
ならば留飲を受けた者に現れるということか。あるいは兆しか。
もう良いか。
ああ、十分です。無礼をしました。すみません。
So, the mark on her face is officially a sign of the dragon heritage, whatever that means. And she seems to be interested in it. She calls it either a sign or a symptom, like it's an illness, which makes sense considering she's a physician. So yeah, lots of talk about this divine heritage.
白いあざは生まれつきではない。ならば留飲を受けた者に現れるということか。あるいは。
Yeah. Nothing new.
ではまた。
So yeah, she's an interesting character. She seems to be a doctor. She is supposed to be helping us for a master that she cannot tell us anything about. She's interesting in the dragon heritage. She calls it a symptom of the dragon heritage. She made one of the most miraculous objects in this entire game. So yeah, lots of questions that will eventually be answered. In the meantime, here there is an interesting thing that does not work. Whatever this is, I mean a passage of some kind, it needs to be opened from the other side, like everything in a From Software game. So in this really cool little cave, there is already a future shortcut to somewhere. And yeah, there is the usual mechanic of there are places where we just cannot use our sword. So these probably were like little lakes originally. I like to think of this place when it wasn't this rundown. How nice it must have been deep into the mountain with little lakes all around. And maybe when the doors were not bashed in and it was covered in talismans. Palette. Oh, another thing now that I think about her is that the sculpture told us that this is a place for people who have nowhere else to go. Now, she seems to be here on a mission, but it is interesting that she's the first one that we encounter when we get out the door after he tells us that. Sculptor's idols are the equivalent to bonfires. We can see that we have our stats. We have memories, we have prayer beads, vitality, attack power, a little blue bar and something that looks like money, and Lastly, on the left, something looks like weird paper thingies. That is a very cool animation. All of that will be explained in time. For now, it's not very important. We can already see, oh, there is also the unseen aid, which is an interesting mechanic that we'll see later. But yeah, much less stats than in any other previous From Software game, or at least the famous one from Demon's Souls onward. Here on the right, we find the person the sculptor told us about. This little clearing with an offertory box.
見ぬ顔だな。そこもと、名は。名乗られぬか。だが、腕ある忍びとお見受けした。忍びの技ならば、あるいは。そこもとよ。ぜひ、それがしと、立ち会ってもらおう。やはり死なぬわな。
So yeah, this guy seems to be immortal. Immediately aggressive, not very difficult, but does not
そこもとの
die.
立ち筋、見事なものであった。それがしをかように従前に殺した者、そうはおらぬ。
お主は何だ？
死なず、あるいは虫つきと呼ぶ者もおるな。死ねぬので、ただここにおるのだ。そこもとはこのような荒れ寺で何よ。随分と眉間にシワが寄っておる。そこもとよ。それがしを使い、刀の修練をせぬか。お主の使命を果たすために。死ねぬ体ゆえ、幾度でも切られてやれるぞ。どうじゃ。
So here we can accept all refuses offer, and it doesn't really make much of a difference. If we refuse, we just get a little bit more dialogue and we can accept afterwards.
そうか。まあ、無理は言わぬ。退屈しのぎになると思うたがな。心変わりしたら言うてくれ。そこもとか。気が向いたかの。それがしを使い、刀の修練を積んでみぬか。
承知した。
よし。ではやろう。刀を振らば気も紛れるというもの。
So, Hanbei the Undying, an interesting character to say the least. He tells us that he's a deathless or uninfested, as some people call him. We still don't know exactly why he calls himself that, but he's very tall, he's covered in scars and apparently cannot die. Now,
そこもとよ。この社には行き場を失った者が集うようだ。俺、現に、それがしもここにおる。だからかの。そこの賽銭箱にも時折何やら流れ着くのよ。
Yeah, as I was saying, I will not be doing the training now because that leads to more dialogues and a lot of time, so I will do that in the next episode instead. But he talks about this offertory box, which sounds exciting, but unfortunately, that's just a gameplay gimmick thingy. If later in the game you lose some vital object or stuff like that, it can appear here and you can kind of buy it back. So it's nothing super interesting, and if you like play a normal playthrough and you don't lose anything, you will not use it at all in the entire game, but it's useful that it's there
こ
for
の社に
emergencies.
は現に
Yeah. Also, he also underlines the fact that these temples attract those with
ま
nowhere
た
else
来
to
る
go.
がいい。底本の技の試し、いくらでも受けようぞ。
But yeah, this immortal guy offers us his body to try techniques on, which is very generous and also kind of creepy. And in the walls there are a lot of statues of Buddha, which do not look at all like the ones that the sculpture was sculpting. They look much more serene. There is an equal amount of them. But yeah, sculpting Buddhas, in this case into stone, seems to be something that people around here really like to do. I really like Sekiro's scenery. It's very, very pretty. It's beautiful. It's very game-like. It's still an area of game which is enclosed and everything, but it captures the beauty of nature. Also, these guys look exactly like the little guys that the sculptor was carving. The statues of Buddha that he was carving, but with more arms and there is more of them. I do not think this thing have much importance lore-wise. I think they're just a gameplay addition, but they are quite nice. So let's move on and do some gameplay after all this talking, shall we? So yeah, this is the first new mechanic that our good old arm gives us, the grappling hook. We come out of this nice little temple and we can already see that whatever original method for reaching it is gone. The only way to get here is through these kind of methods, which is very fun to do. It's again much more intuitive than you would expect from a company that really did not do anything very platform-like. But yeah, this raises the question of how Emma got there, which will be answered in the future. What a nice view. We see Ashina Castle in the distance, very clearly now. It's very impressive, but all the majesty is kind of undercut by how broken everything is around here. There is a broken bridge over there, we see a broken section of wall with an item over there. Everything seems to be run down. Now we encounter a second idol, which will prompt the full tutorial. Yeah, we can travel between idols. Quick travel is a thing, even though the map is very interconnected. Which, you know, quick travel is always something that is a bit controversial in a way, but it works well for navigating the environment, and maybe I will have more to talk about it in later episodes. For now, let's focus on what's here. Namely, Ungo Sugar. Sugar candy made in Senpo Temple, sustaining Ungo's blessing. Temporarily reduces vitality damage taken from physical attacks. Bite the candy and take the Ungo stance to impart its inhuman benediction. By doing so, you endure the excess karma of man from the spirits within. Senpo monks spread this candy across Ashina in honor of their military heroes. So, this is an interesting item. Oh, as a word of warning, I tend to not use items in general. I am a lazy player like that. But this is an interesting item. It raises defenses and it has a weird description. It introduces us to Senpo Temple, which will be relevant later. And it has a really weird something about enduring the karma of man, which I hope to talk about in a little bit more detail later. But yeah, And it is spread around Ashina to celebrate his military heroes. So it was probably here owing to someone who was defending the outskirts from invaders. Oh, nice mountains. Here is a first victim. And this is how drops work. So instead of collecting them one by one, we can kind of siphon them like this. We get our first coins and no other kinds of drops. He fell in a very majestic pose, didn't he? So the base gameplay of the game is something like, well, what we've seen in the tutorial, with the addition of now we have a much better mobility. And I was immediately discovered. So if we just stay up here, we're not invulnerable, because they will try to get us down. And we cannot do a stealth. No, we can't just massacre them. These guys are really not hard. So, I just seen a little bit for this guy, who looks a bit stronger than the guys without the hat and with lighter armor. The base of Sekiro is this... Sorry, I was distracted. Is this clash between attack and defense. We deflect their attacks by blocking at the right time, and they can do the same to us, which happen automatically if we just try to wail on them. The first one to get the posture to break, the opponent's posture to break, can get a big damage. In the case of normal enemies, an immediate death. So there are a couple of items around. More pallets. And here, ceramic shard. A piece of pottery that breaks with a satisfying crack when thrown. Throw it at an enemy to draw their attention. Throwing and smashing such pieces made for a popular sport amongst Ashina boys. Even after growing up, they remember the old games well. So this item is simply a way for attracting enemies. It's not that useful, and they're going to be very, very, very common. Here is a broken bridge. We cannot do much here, but this is where the entrance to this section was originally located before the bridge collapsed, or was broken. In a country constantly under siege, breaking bridges does not seem like a bad idea. So we already murdered a couple of people, and we can murder much more. But as you can see, this place has a lot of different ways to approach it. Enemies are... oh yeah, this is pretty scary. Look at that. Enemies have an interesting relationship with eyesight. They can be incredibly good or incredibly dumb. For example, I just murdered a man in full view of these guys, and they did not notice. But if I just step outside, they will start to notice me, at least that guy will. They're not super smart as far as AI go in terms of stealth mechanics, but they work really well for what the game wants to do. That guy had a gun. We need to be careful about guns now. But yeah, the exchange of attack and defense that this game has is very different from... Whoa! Yeah, dogs. That happened more suddenly than I expected. But as I was saying, yeah, there are dogs in this game. They're really cool. They look more like wolves than actual dogs. They serve the Ashina. And you can do some grisly but very cool looking last hits on them. But yeah, as I was saying, the balance between attack and defense, more pellets, that is the staple of this game, is very different from any other hack and slash game I've ever played. They make you feel a lot more part of the action and less like attacking is just a thing that you do that is kind of separate from what the opponent is doing, which is the norm in hack and slash, where you focus on attacking when the opponent is not and not getting hit, but it's two separate things. Now your attack and the opponent attacks are a constant exchange that is part of a mutual dance of death, if you want to be very fancy about it. More ash. I like the image of Wolf just pocketing a bunch of ash from this campfire. Let's see if I can do it. No? I thought. Oh, apparently not. You can link, yeah, like that. You can link the grappling hook to very satisfying effects. And... oh, hello, did not notice you. That wasn't as clean as everything else, but we do get a ceramic shard that this guy was carrying today. Probably to play with his friend, good guy. This is the drop that we saw at the beginning, just another ceramic shard. Yeah, this is the entrance where we came from, but there is a little secret underneath here. A little entrance that we can see if we are very careful. I was about to die in a very dumb way. There is something as well that we will be able to get to later, and in this little hidden temple we find Akko Sugar. The description is pretty much the same. Bite the candy and take the Akko stance to impart its inhuman benediction. The spirits embody excess karma. Again, a really weird description. One must bite down hard on the candy and endure what has been brought to pass. So this is an attack booster rather than the Ungo's defense booster. And I will have a lot to say about the sugars later on. They are interesting items and they have not been translated super well, I feel. Missed. Now, I'm almost at the part where I want to stop from this episode, but there are a couple of other things. The first is the best surprise that this game has to offer, which I think is over here. Yes, there is the idol, and here is my best friend. It's Mr. Chicken. he's very... he's much more dangerous than a chicken has any right to be. Let's do something. A bit exaggerated for a giant chicken, but yes. And chickens do not drop coins like the dogs before, and also right now. Giant animals and giant chickens. If you play Bloodborne, the chickens are very similar to the crows in that they're really weak and they will die very fast. But if they catch you off guard, they will just destroy you. They do a lot of damage very, very, very fast. Then there are the dogs, which I missed. But yeah, dogs as well are very fragile. I think it is very good and kill them in a dynamic way. They're by themselves, they're really not hard. It's cool that they introduced them here when there is just the three of them, these two and the one that caught me off guard before. So you know what to expect, but they're going to be dangerous only when together with other people. More ceramic shards, more collapsed buildings. Little tree in the middle of nowhere. Does not serve any real purpose, but to give us some indication there is more secrets over there. And up here is where we're going to stop today with this interesting reveal. This guy looks exactly like the one that took our master away from us, and he's apparently dead, has a big ol' weapon with him, and has this item. Shuriken Wheel. A mechanical device made by the mechanical genius Dogen. Can be fit into the shinobi prosthetic to become a working prosthetic tool. While it is palm size, a surprising number of shuriken can fit into the Shuriken Wheel, as the edges were designed for stacking. A fine example of what can be achieved when one matches mechanical finesse with a shinobi's talent. The first shinobi item, prosthetic tool. Yes. We can feed prosthetic tool by going back to the sculptor, which is what we're going to do first off next episode. And it also is an interesting item because it mentions Dogen. Dogen was mentioned as an extraordinary doctor in the Healing Guard, and is apparently also a mechanical genius. He seems to be kind of a jack of all trades. Also by killing thing you will see that the blue bar is filling up, and next skill points will come with another 286 experience or whatever it's called. So that's the closest to a level up that we get in this game. It's skill points, but we will discover them next time as well. Now, I don't want to progress much more. I think this episode is long enough for now. So we can conclude by resting in front of this new idol, which is called the Outskirts Wall Gate Path. An interesting name. But yeah, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed. I hoped the audio quality was much better this time, and that I was a little bit more focused about showing the game and the dialogues and everything. And if you are interested in the analysis, then keep on watching. Otherwise, I will see you the next time. Bye. Hi, welcome back. So this was quite a dialogue-heavy episode, but we did still get to see a little bit of progression, and we got through what the bases of the game are like, both in the combat and the navigation, and from the next episode I think things are going to be much more exciting. I'm still learning how to play and talk at the same time in a way that does not detract from any of the two parts, so it means that right now I'm a bit unfocused and slow. When I try to discuss the game, there is just a lot happening at the same time, but thank you for your patience in reaching up until this point, and I'm sure I will become better in time. As you can hear, I'm trying a couple of new things. I've added music in the background, and I'm playing around a little bit with the order in which I will explain things in this section. Under the suggestion from a friend of mine, I will not be going into as much detail as I went to doing the research in a couple of topics, and I added more description in text in the video description if any of you is going to be interested about those specific topics. So regarding the order in which I will talk about the various topics that I want to go over, I've decided to change things up a bit compared to the first episode, and instead of going into chronological order as to when things happen during the video, to divide the topics into subjects. So I will start by translating the dialogues and the names of the different new NPCs that we found and talking a little bit about them, then go into the translations of the places, names, and the item description, and then finish with the cultural references and influences that were already present in this initial part of the game. And that's the part where I will use the video description to provide extra tidbits for people who are interested in those subjects. I'm not necessarily sure that this is how I will do it moving along and going into the future, but I want to try now and see which I prefer. So let's start by going over the new characters that we met at the Ruin Temple. From Software has a real knack in conveying a lot of nuance and subtlety through their dialogues and naming conventions, and this game is no exception. I personally think that it has the best characters in any From Software game that I've played, but a lot of that depth and quality is kind of hidden behind how to translate things, so I think it's very rewarding for us to go over them a little bit, starting from the names. I already talked a little bit about the sculptors' names in Japanese, how it's not just sculptor, it's Bushi, which is specifically a sculptor of Buddhist statues. And I will talk more about the importance of Buddhist culture in general, but so for now, let's leave him at that, and I will return to him when I translate these dialogues. Now, Emma is a fascinating name for this character, mainly because it's not a Japanese name and it is written in katakana, which is the phonetic alphabet reserved for non-Japanese words. I do not know if this implies that she's a Westerner. I cannot tell by just looking at her model if she's supposed to be a different ethnicity than the rest of the cast, but this is not to be excluded, as we will discover more about her past, that she's not from Japanese descent, but I'm not sure about that. What is certain is that the name clashes a lot with the fact that she's one of the most Japanese appearing character in the game, in the way that she acts and she talks and how she seems to embody this kind of ideal of Japanese refinement. And the names makes her out to be an outsider. It clearly defines her as someone different from the other people, in the same way in which we have official people with, a name and a surname, and they're clearly Japanese and they're part of the system, and then we have people like Wolf or the sculptor or Emma, who just by name alone seems to be kind of outside of all of that. And lastly, there is Hanbei the Undying, a very puzzling character, mainly because unfortunately he's not going to be very well developed in the base game. I've discovered recently that a prequel in the form of a manga called Sekiro Side Story, Hanbei the Undying, was released, but I haven't read that yet, so I cannot really comment on it. I hope that in the future, when I talk more about this character, I will have that already under my belt, so I will be able to include it. But for now, what I can say is that his name seems to be something of a historical reference. There was a much more famous figure called Hanbei, which was the nickname of Takenaka Shigeharu, a brilliant young strategist of weak constitution that served under Toyotomi Hideyoshi and died in 1579 at 34 years of age of a tragic illness during one of his campaigns. He's a fairly popular figure, so I don't think it was accidental. And I don't know yet how important that parallel is, but it definitely it allows us to clock Hanbei as somebody who used to be a samurai, used to be involved in war, and seems to have fallen quite down in the social ladder to be found in this state, in this place. So, moving on to the translation of the dialogues. These were generally well translated in English, so except for a couple of things that were left out entirely, mostly I will be talking about differences in nuance or in tone between the English and Japanese characterization. So, starting with the sculptor, his dialogue is in general pretty accurate, but what I felt wasn't entirely conveyed in English, for obvious reason it's very hard to convey, is he has a really weird attitude towards us, and he expresses us in the way that he speaks mostly. He seems to be randomly and casually rude in a way that is very weird in Japanese society, which is usually ultra polite, but not in a provocative way. It feels like somebody who has been outside of civilization quite a lot. For example, the way that he refers to Wolf most of the time is Omae-san, which is a mixture of Omae, which is a very rude way of saying you, and san, which is a honorific, so it might have been a teasing way of referring to him or something, but it's definitely very unique. Also, in general, his attitude seems to be a mixture between being gruff and almost seemingly hostile, but in his action he's always very helpful and accommodating, and he's ready to assist us, and he saved our lives, so a puzzling character overall. Also, he refers to himself with washi, which is a way of saying I, which is reserved to older people, so he definitely seems to be not just ugly but old, and seems to think of himself as a senior of some kind. considering that, as I already talked during the playthrough, he probably was the previous owner of the Shinobi prosthetic and seems to know a lot about ninjas in general. He probably considered himself retired and is quite the old Shinobi himself. Wolf, for his own part, in this dialogue is again much less hostile and more just sparse and untalkative in Japanese. When his name is asked, his original answer is a very neutral, I can't say, I can't answer that, to which the sculptor reply is, well, that's just how shinobis are, huh? Like, again, like if he knows a lot about what being a shinobi means in practice. With this frame in mind, the rest of his dialogue is generally pretty accurate. There are just a couple of small changes that I find are interesting to point out, and a couple of inaccuracies left. The first in the questions you can ask him, the first one is actually ask about yourself, and not what happened to you, which is interesting. I mean, it means the same thing, just a small interesting thing. And when Wolf says this device, I see this device, he's again using the term karakuri, which means that he basically has noticed that there is a lot of space inside of his left arm that he can fit different contraptions in. He's not referring to the whole thing as if he just noticed the entire arm is a mechanism. Then, mainly there are these two little inaccuracies. When, in this part, the sculptor doesn't say that he said too much, like he just revealed a secret and anything like that, but he's just being self-deprecating. He's just saying something like he has already chatted for too long, or look at me talking away too much, something like that. And lastly, when talking about Kuro, he's not saying that someone is after him, he's saying that he's a target, I think in a more general sense, that his special blood just makes him a precious target for people who would want that power for themselves. Moving on to Emma. Generally her dialogues in English are very accurately translated, except for a couple of cases in which it really isn't. They just change some things or left out things, and I don't really understand why, but that's what I'm here for, I guess. In general, the main thing that in English they managed to convey, but not quite the full extent of it, is how formal and polite Emma's way of speaking is. She speaks like a refined noblewoman at all times. So more than a noblewoman, a refined servant. She is always extremely kind, she always apologizes, she uses a very flowery way of saying everything. She looks like she is used to living in a court, and she's a completely different person in the way that she presents herself from both Hanbei and the sculpture, who are both very rude and crude and apparently completely out of the civilization in general. As to what they changed or left out of her dialogue, the first one is a very minor one. When she talks about the dragon's blood, she's using the same word that was previously translated as dragon heritage, which can be translated as the dragon bloodline more accurately, but I don't know why they did two different translations here, that probably was just a slip. Then later, and this is probably the most important, she doesn't say that she's serving a certain master. She's saying that she serves an ally of the monkey. And as we will discover later, the monkey is the way that she refers to the sculptor in general. So her master is connected to the sculptor, which is probably why she's here in the first place. In English, it's not entirely clear why she's here specifically. She seems to just be following us, but in Japanese it's made clear that whoever is the master that she's serving, that master is connected to the sculptor specifically. Lastly, Wolf does not ask her for a way to improve the healing gird, like it's this weird meta question that nobody would even ask in real life. he's asking, so, what can you do for me as a doctor? Because beforehand she has told us that she will help us in her capacity as a doctor, and he's just, well, following up on that and saying, so, what can you do for me then as a doctor? And then she replies, I can upgrade your gird, I can make it better if you find seeds. Which I feel is just a more organic way of introducing the upgrade rather than the weird meta way they used in English. And in conclusion, we have Hanbei, whose English translation is generally pretty accurate. The only differences are a couple of missed nuances or differences in tone, so this should be pretty brief. In general, his speech pattern seems to be that of somebody who used to be a samurai of higher standing, but has lived into the wild or lived a life of poverty so much that he has lost most of the original complexity and nobility of words. But, for example, he still uses Sokomoto to refer to us, which is a very antiquated way for a samurai to refer to somebody who is equal or inferior to them. So he sounds a little bit like somebody who used to have like a fancy accent and has lived into the wild for years and still have some traces of that in the way that he speaks. Then here he's not wondering whether we are a shinobi or something else. He's saying maybe if it is by a shinobi technique, perhaps. And later when he revives, he said, as I thought, I'm still not dead. So basically, he just wanted to try if maybe one of our shinobi techniques would be the trick to killing him, but wasn't really hoping much about it. He was just saying, why not try in this case? Then later, when he explains what he is, he says that he's undying, but the words in Japanese for infested is more specifically haunted by insects, in the same way that you could have like a haunted house or a haunting. So in Japanese there is this reference to insects and bugs which are infesting him. And in the last part, he doesn't say that we seem to have a lot on our mind in such an abstract way, but he remarks on how often we seem to frown. It's a very specific remark on the fact that we have a very lined and frowny face, which will come back later, I think, in the next episodes. Now, moving on from the characters to other translations, the names of the locations we encounter are generally pretty accurate, but there were a couple of small differences that I want to focus on for a little while. The first one is that Ashina outskirts in Japanese is more specifically Ashina's castle's outskirts. As to say, we are not at the border of the country, we're just at the border of the main fortified city, the capital of Ashina. The second small difference is that last idol that we find, which in English is called the Outskirt Wall Gate Path idol, in Japanese is a little bit more details, and it's the Outskirt Outer Wall Castle Gates Path, meaning that we are now at the outer wall of the fortified city, and progressing on this path we'll encounter the main gate to go in, which doesn't change anything, but it's a little bit more detailed than what is given to us in English. Then, before moving on to the translation of the item description proper, I just want to remark that the name for the idols themselves is very different in Japanese. They are the Oni Buddhas, Oni being a word that loosely means demon or ogre, and I think this underlines the corrupted nature of the creation of the sculptor, who is supposed to be sculpting statues of Buddha, but what comes out is this demonic, corrupt version of that ideal. And now moving on to the ever popular item description, starting from the ceramic shards. The translation in general is pretty accurate, there are only a couple of minor changes. The first one being that they're more generally called pottery shards in Japanese, using a very outdated term at that. The fact that they give the name of the game of tossing ceramic pieces to each other that the children of Ashina used to play, which is called wariko, which I think is a play on words but unfortunately eludes me. And lastly, The last line is a little bit more tongue-in-cheek in original, and more properly reads, "Even if grown up, everyone is still an expert at the game." The Ungo and Ako sugars are unfortunately much more complex. Starting from their names, these are a portmanteau of those of the two guardian deities Ungyo and Agyo, and of the kanji for protection and attack, respectively. Ungyo and Agyo are fascinating mythological figures. They were warriors who escorted the Buddha on his travels and are more commonly known together as the Neo. I have included a link in the description with much more info on them, but at least by sight you probably already know of them. The description of the items are also very complex in Japanese, which is probably why they're so obscure in English. The sentence in Ungo Sugar about enduring the excess karma of men goes something like this in original. The spirit fall is a divine phenomenon that remains in the body of man. Therefore, bite the sugar and endure. Which is also very obscure and confusing, but it creates certain links between items that in the English translation were omitted. That is, the spirit fall is going to be an item that we'll find in the future, and Ako Sugar reference the spirit fall in more detail. Also, the original text makes it seem like the sugars were not spread to honor Ashina's past heroes like in English, as much as to actively help out those that bravely still defend their lands. In the description of the Ako Sugar, the meaning of spirit fall is then expanded upon. It describes what happens when you bite the candy as making the protection of the spirits of the deceased fall upon oneself, while the last line is the same as Ungo's bit about spirit fall. I will talk more about spirit fall and the sugars in future episodes, when what I believe to be the way they actually function will become much clearer. Lastly, we have the Shuriken Wheel. The name of Dogen comes up again, this time not as a doctor, but as a master of mechanical contraptions, as it would be more accurately translated. The same friend that helped me in the translations for the previous episode pointed out that the word karakuri is also used to mean traps, which works well with this setup of ninja tools for assassination. The final line of the description is also slightly different. In Japanese, it specifies that the same craftsmanship with ninja contraptions was also used in the creation of the shinobi prosthetic, implying that it was Dogen that built that as well. The figure of Dogen is then linked to a lot of different characters in this game for now. It was apparently Emma's master, he seems to have built the shinobi prosthetic that the sculptor gave us, and this specific item was in the possession of one of the mysterious figures that kidnapped Kuro, meaning that somehow they seems to have their hands on Dogen's creations as well. So quite a mysterious character is being set up here. Now, the last of the items that we find in this section of gameplay is the light coin purse, but while that is not worth talking about in terms of translation, because the description is pretty accurate and it's just a bag of coins, it is a nice segue into the first of the cultural reference that I want to talk about, namely money in Sekiro. Now, the English translation they decided on for the kanji used to indicate the currency in Sekiro is sen. Now, I think that is not exactly correct, because it is true that the kanji can be pronounced sen, but that indicates a specific currency that wasn't used until 1873 and just means cent or a fraction of a yen. During Sekiro's time period, that word just meant something like spare change and was instead pronounced zeni, small coins made out of iron and copper rather than noble metals like gold and silver. Now, that is a bit confusing to me, because the illustration of the coin bag shows them being clearly filled with what looks like koban, which were a specific kind of oval-shaped gold coins, while the little UI prompt we get when we acquire money is instead shaped like proper zeni coins. Now, I'm probably just overthinking this whole thing, but I did go down quite a rabbit hole in researching medieval Japanese currency, so if anyone is interested, I included a little bit of a paragraph of what I found in the description. Now I would like to move on to more important cultural references and details instead. One of the most striking features of the dilapidated temple are definitely the countless talismans that are affixed to its walls. These are actual religious implements. They are called Ofuda or Gofu and can be granted by both Shinto shrines and Buddhist temple. The way they work is that they are supposedly imbued with a blessing from a Shinto kami or a revered Buddhist figure, and each of them serves a specific purpose, such as a generic bringer of good luck, purifying a spiritually corrupt area, or protecting from evil influences. They can be either carried around by a person or affixed to a structure, and they are supposed to be changed yearly to avoid spiritual stagnation, which in Japanese belief is one of the main sources of impurity and corruption. This means that this area was considered dangerous enough on a spiritual level to be completely filled with these protections, but also the fact that it is so abandoned now means that these talismans that were probably supposed to be keeping the corruption and demonic influence of the place at bay have now become just part of the overall abandonment of this place, making it unwelcome to most people, except apparently those that have nowhere else to go. Next, as we've seen, Ashina's samurai are equipped with rifles. The history of firearms in Japan is fascinating, and I've included a lot of more details in the description, but for now, suffice to say that by this time period, firearms were very common in Japanese standing armies. They were earlier imported from China, and it was Oda Nobunaga that started using them regularly to defeat the power imbalance that the samurai caste had up until that point. Samurai's families were the ones with the better training and the better equipment, which made them almost unbeatable without some kind of special method, and rifles and cannons and other firearms were that method. They were the great equalizer that completely changed the way the battles were fought in Japan. It's interesting that Ashina has them, and we'll discover much more later as to where they acquired them, but for now I will conclude by saying that the main thing that made them so good is that they could be used by peasants and even by women in a way that made them as deadly as a trained samurai with a bow or a sword. And even if they were maybe less reliable than those weapons, this makes the protection, especially of isolated places like this, much easier, because you can arm the entire population basically. I think that what we're fighting here are still samurais that are trained with them, but it's an important detail, I think, that will become much more relevant as we go further into the game. Now, regarding this beautiful giant chicken we can find here, and thinking back on the giant geckos we found in the tutorial, giant animals are very common in Japanese folklore, as a commonly held superstition is that animals could acquire human intelligence and even supernatural powers if they live long enough, usually exponentially growing in size in the process. In Sekiro, the great size of some of the animals encountered are almost certainly linked more to the special properties of Ashina, which we'll discover more about in the future, rather than this classical folkloristic belief. But this tendency to use giant animals rather than just straight up monster for most non-human enemies encountered in the game contributes to giving the fantasy aspects of the setting a more traditional character throughout. Roosters in particular have a ton of folkloristic and religious significance attached to them, depending on where you go in Japan, including being part of the Chinese zodiac, embodying the virtue of courage, acting as protection against fire, being divine messages, and appearing as helpful figures in numerous myths and legends, just to name a few. But to be fair, all of that is not really relevant to the marginal role they play in Sekiro, where they mostly just are adorable, deadly, humongous chickens. And lastly, Buddhist sculpture features prominently in Sekiro, starting from the figure of the sculpture and leading to this mysterious carving that surround the offertory box, and we'll see much later there are going to be much more extreme examples of it, but I am sad to say that I really am out of my depth regarding these subjects, which would require a much more extensive level of preparation than what I'm equipped with to provide the analysis it deserves. I have included a link to a very thorough database of Buddhist art if anyone is interested, together with some interesting facts that are linked to Sekiro, and I use those to draw some conclusions, but yeah, be warned that there is probably a lot of nuance that I'm just missing when I'm playing this game. What I could surmise from the research that I've done are mainly these two details that are relevant right now. The first is that I believe that the true sculpture mentioned by the sculpture was probably inspired by the historical figure of Enku, who was an itinerant ascetic monk who is allegedly responsible for around 120,000 pieces of Buddhist sculpture, and that was the main inspiration for the resurgence of Buddhist sculpture into the 17th century, and the fact that all the pieces of sculpture, especially the stone sculpture like those around the offertory box we find in Sekiro, is really ancient. Because during the Sengoku period, because of all the civil unrest, Buddhist sculpture really wasn't practiced, it wasn't popular, it wasn't in any way endorsed by the state, and stone sculpture was never really popular at all in Japan, where they favored instead wooden sculptures. So this gives the land of Ashina this feeling of being a very spiritual place and having been so for a very long time. And this was it for this episode. Thank you so much for sticking until the end. This was shorter than the first one, but not by the margin that I hoped, so I really hope that going forward I will get better at it and maybe manage to make shorter and shorter episodes where I can say everything I want to say in a more concise and organized manner. But until then, I hope that you had fun and you found this interesting, and I will see you next time. Have a good day now.